Can we please sit down? Can you please take your seats? Yes, let's come in. Julian, you go. Yes? You go.
Okay, let me tell them where to go.
Can we please sit down?
Sigrid, do you have a microphone or? No, it's fine. You do. No, that's good. If you wouldn't mind taking a seat, we are going to begin this session now. Welcome back, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Julian Barnes-Dacey, and I'm the director of ECFR's Middle East and North Africa program. I'm delighted to see so many of you. And I would love to say that I'm delighted to be hosting this panel, but given the conditions that we're going to be speaking of, the situation in Gaza and Israel, the situation across the broader Middle East, it's hard to paint a positive light on what we're going to be talking about. But clearly it's an important moment given what's happening in the Middle East. And I'm really delighted that we have such a distinguished and active panel to consider the urgency of this question and what can be done. We're delighted that Spanish Foreign Minister Alvarez, who is hosting us here in Madrid, has been able to join us for this session. The Saudi Foreign Minister, Prince Faisal bin Farhan Al Saud, delighted that you are here. And Sigrid Kaag, of course, who is known to many of you, who is now the UN Senior Humanitarian and Reconstruction Coordinator. So really there is no better group of assembled outside participants to be talking about what's happening in the region at the moment. Clearly this is a situation that will first and foremost need to be resolved and a peace wave track found between Israelis and Palestinians themselves. And we at ECFR are doing a lot with both Israelis and Palestinians to try and support that effort. But we thought that this would be a very good moment to think about the external role and influence on the situation both in Gaza and in the broader Middle East. And obviously, given that we are at ECFR, to think particularly about what this means for the European role. Two very quick framing points. One is just to highlight the magnitude of the kind of devastation that we're talking about since Hamas's horrific attack on October 7th. Obviously, more than 1,000 Israeli killed, more than 120 hostages still imprisoned in Gaza, 40,000 Palestinians now killed. Save the Children said in the last couple of days that 21,000 children have either died or are missing, 21,000 children. Since early May, when we had the incursion into Rafah, which was at one point a red line for the US and other Western states, we've seen more than 3,000 people killed. The fighting obviously continues now in Khan el-Yunis, which was supposed to be a safe zone. We're now seeing new Israeli attacks there, which are putting new pressure on Palestinians looking for refuge. In the West Bank, We've seen a massive surge in new settlements. Just yesterday, I think 3,000 new acres seized, 6,000 new homes announced in settlements by the Israeli government yesterday. And obviously, that kind of strikes at the heart of prospects of a two-state solution. Then we have a regional situation, Lebanon, Israel, absolutely on fire. We saw a serious escalation yesterday and today with an Israeli assassination of a Hezbollah operative, and hundreds of Hezbollah missiles flying across. And then just lastly, I mean, it's going on right across the region, but Yemen, you know, last month saw the largest number of attacks since January of this year when we saw the start of the military operation by the Western-led coalition. So clearly there's a grave risk of not just a deepening catastrophe, humanitarian crisis, an end to the political process in Israel, Palestine itself, but we're all very aware of the risks of regional escalation. The second quick point is a point that was made by the High Representative this morning. Europe has effectively been irrelevant on this file, has not been able to stand up. The High Representative talked of our disunity, our inability to be an actor here, and the impact that this is having on our credibility on broader international files. So that is the backdrop to this conversation. And I'm hoping, despite the grimness of that overview, that this can nonetheless be a presentation where we think about, well, what are the options? What can we still do to try and make the situation better, to ameliorate the humanitarian situation, open up the prospects of a humanitarian improvement and a regional settlement? Minister Alvarez, if I may, let me come to you first. Spain has been at the forefront of European states taking a stand on this issue. We've seen the recognition of Palestine, we've seen support for the ICJ, clear calls for an end to the military incursion, and support for a peace conference. Can you give us a sense of the strategy behind these moves? I mean, we see lots of positive steps, but how do we turn that into something meaningful that can resonate on the ground, that can change the equations? And given what the High Representative said this morning about European weakness, how can we get Spain to work alongside other actors in Europe to really mobilize tools of action that can move, press, work with both the Palestinians and the Israelis, but also regional states to help us get in a better direction? Minister, please.
First, I thank you for choosing Madrid, which is a great city to do this together, and I'm very happy to be with two very good friends here in this panel, the two people that are doing a lot for peace and stability in the Middle East. Spain has taken two actions that stand out in what the European Union is doing. First is the recognition of the state of Palestine, and the last one was last Friday, in which we decided to participate in the ICJ claim of South Africa. What we are trying to do is to try to help that permanent ceasefire that will bring a lasting peace, to advocate since October the 7th for the liberation of all hostages, and also to speak up in order to make sure that humanitarian assistance can enter Gaza and to get to the civilian people. And everything we are doing, it's aimed at that. The recognition, that decision, we have taken it because we all know what will bring definite peace and stability to the Middle East. And it's a Palestinian state living in good neighborhood with a state of Israel. And the only tool that we have right now to protect this two-state solution that we all know is the solution, it has been agreed many times between Israelis and Palestinians in the last decades. The only tool is recognition, to make sure that we protect what will bring peace. The decision of participating in the claim in the ICJ has come for two different reasons. The most important one is there is already a ruling of the court saying that the military operation in Rafah must be stopped. And Israel has shown that has no intention. And the rulings are compulsory for everyone, including for Israel. And the second one is because we see actions that we understand that fall under the convention for which South Africa has taken the claim. The systematic destruction of infrastructure for basic services for civilian, water, energy, putting obstacles to the entrance of humanitarian aid to civilian population in Gaza, for us, clearly falls under that convention. We are trying to lead, together with the High Representative, and I really commend his very courageous role since the beginning of the war in Gaza. We are trying to lead European unity. And in order to mobilize, we need more unity in Europe. Europe can do more politically, not only to say what we should do, but also we should take actions if things don't go in the sense that we say. We can do more in humanitarian assistance because the figures are there. We are increasing our humanitarian assistance to the Palestinian Authority, but the funds sometimes are not being disbursed. We see unacceptable actions as upholding the tax revenues by the Israelis that should be in the hands of the Palestinian Authority, and we can do a lot to prepare the day after, because one day peace will go back. That's why we have put at the table a peace conference in which we will implement, this is not a peace conference, it was in Madrid in '91 or in Oslo. We know all the parameters. It's time to implement the two-state solution, to make a big plan of reconstruction for Gaza, to put Gaza and the West Bank under one single Palestinian Authority. And in order to do that, and I count a lot on my good friend, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Saudi Arabia, Europeans and the Arab Islamic group, we must start to talk together and to have action together.
Minister, thank you. Minister, thank you very much. Prince Farhan, Saudi Arabia is not directly involved in some of the immediate negotiations on the ceasefire, such in the same way that Qatar and Egypt is. But Riyadh has very much been centered as the pathway to a solution. Sometimes it's others more than Riyadh talking about this, and we obviously hear a lot from DC about the need for a normalization deal to open up the prospects of peace. But those of us that have been following this have seen the active role that Riyadh has played in terms of formulating and sharing and putting out the Arab Vision paper, working with our other Arab states to put out a plan, offering political engagement, normalization with Israel, prospect of a security force in Gaza. That hasn't borne fruit yet, and I know there have been some good conversation with the Europeans. The last FACT meeting, I think, was pretty productive on this issue. But how do we go from a vision, a plan, as the Spanish minister said, we all know what the end game is, to operationalizing this? Is there more that Riyadh can be doing and is prepared to do to actually move the levers of influence to actually create some traction? Because we seem to be going the other direction at the moment. And the longer this goes on, the harder it seems to envisage actually a prospect of peace at the end of it all.
Well, thank you, and thank you for having me. And of course, it's a very desperate situation we're in, and we continue to see constant deterioration, whether it's in Gaza or now even further in the West Bank. We see a continuing degradation of the viability of a two-state solution, which means that any prospects for a day after are constantly being diminished, because any prospect of a viable, what has now been agreed by everybody seems to call the day after plan for Gaza, must be based on a political perspective for the Palestinian people. It cannot viably be otherwise, and it certainly cannot be a basis of engagement for the Arab countries otherwise. And that requires, again, a viable pathway to a two-state solution. And here, I want to commend what Spain and others have done through recognition, because that is one of the few slivers of hope that remain out there, one of the few kindling that remains being put on the fire of the prospect of a two-state solution. And I hope that others will follow suit, and I hope that Europe will play a more active role in keeping the hope and the prospect of a two-state solution alive through the conference that we and our friends in Spain are now engaged in discussing, and other mechanisms that can hopefully keep that alive. And in the end, any talk about whether it's a security arrangement in Gaza or anything else can only happen in the context of a broader political perspective for the Palestinian people. And this is absolutely necessary, because And in these discussions, we are, as you rightly said, we've had them with our American friends, we've had them with Europe as well. We've submitted, as the Arab group, very concrete ideas about what a day after could mean in the context of Gaza and the West Bank. And the unfortunate reality is that without a permanent ceasefire, none of this can actually even start to be discussed in a detailed way. And that doesn't seem to be forthcoming as yet. And honestly, this is right now a desperately depressing situation, because we see no prospect for a ceasefire. We see a deterioration in the humanitarian situation. The regional situation, as you also described, is further being inflamed. We are risking spiraling into an even worse direction. That said, we are ready, as Saudi Arabia, as the Arab countries, to engage positively with our partners in the international community to forge a better path. But that will also require actions by Israel and actions by those countries that have the leverage over Israel to ensure that this constant undermining of the prospects for a two-state solution doesn't continue, because otherwise, it will be, we are, you saw this this further confiscation of land recently, and this is just one small part of a consistent strategy of degradation of the Palestinian Authority and its ability to be a viable solution. And when it comes to issues such as humanitarian access, again, one of the things that has been very difficult to watch is this constant back and forth of some access granted only to be taken away. And all of these issues are making it harder and harder to viably discuss the prospects for a day after and the two-state solution afterwards. That as Minister Alvarez rightly said, is by consensus the only true pathway to a sustainable peace for the region, including for Israel.
Minister, thank you. Sigrid Kaag, let me please come to you. You're one of the few Europeans who spent some considerable time in Gaza. And I'd love to firstly just get your sense on just how bad things are. There's obviously a risk that it kind of fades into background noise that it's been happening so long. But you painted a very grim picture at the UN Security Council yesterday or the day beforehand. Just how desperate is the humanitarian situation? And then obviously, what is your call in terms of particularly what Europeans can and should be doing here? You talked about the new mechanisms that you're putting into place, but you also recognize that since the Rafah offensive, levels of aid have actually decreased going into Gaza. You talked about the need for more political will. Can you unpack that a bit? What do you mean by political will? Who doing what?
Let me check if the microphone works. Yes, thank you very much. Yes, but of course, just to clarify, I'm in Gaza and carrying my UN hat, not as a European. I happen to be European with, of course, a bleeding European heart, but that's something else. What I think is, I think words cannot describe the dystopia of what Gaza has become. Any sense or any element of what is left of someone's human dignity is taken away by war, by the displacement, by the sheer absence of any fulfillment of their basic needs. We have to forget Gaza, the Gaza population in the old days was fairly middle class. People lived in houses. It's not a tribal population of the 19th century that lives in tents. This is not a glorification of a past. Houses, schools, high education levels, committed despite the closure of all these years or the Hamas regime imposed on them. These are people that never gave up hope. And you have to remember that when you look at the sheer destitution and the dystopia that takes place in Gaza. Now, what I described in the Security Council, that despite after 9 months of warfare, which does affect civilians first and foremost, waiting for a ceasefire and the unconditional release of all hostages, these are people that need to somehow go on with their lives. Lost families, homes, everything. We're dealing with high levels, the highest levels of food insecurity. We're dealing with the absence of shelter, clean water, latrines. All the elements of basic common sense, I would say, but humanity. Now, political will is both decision-making and the will to exercise pressure. The political will, of course, is first and foremost that of the Israeli government in decisions it makes and seeing through on its commitments. We've seen in April, after a lot of pressure on the Netanyahu government in the wake of the killing of the WCK humanitarian workers, that a number of commitments were made. They were incrementally being implemented. One has to acknowledge that. And we've seen subsequently a change in food security temporarily in the north of Gaza. Aid was coming in and our ability to distribute was improving. However, with the Rafah operation, the closure of the Rafah border crossing, which has affected the volume of aid being allowed to get in, we've also seen an uptake in lawlessness and criminality. And this impacts deeply any ability of humanitarians to work. Whilst food is piling up, potentially on Kerem Abu Salem, Kerem Shalom, the crossing, I think that's known now worldwide, we can't get it, we can't retrieve it. So everything is perhaps a step forward, but 2 steps back. And the only conclusion is it affects lives and livelihoods of people, it affects their prospects. And coming back to political will, ultimately, indeed, the political will to arrive at a ceasefire, to release unconditionally all hostages, and to truly start about governance and the security arrangements. Because without that, we risk not only forgetting about Gaza, as primetime television political attention drifts towards perhaps the even greater risks of a Lebanon war, and what that means in terms of destabilization of the region, but people are not assisted. And a safe and secure Israel alongside an independent Palestinian state is nowhere nearer. And we come back to this issue for decades now. What can Europe do? Well, it's true. To be honest, as a former minister in different councils of the European Union, I recognize very much what Pepe said about disunity. I mean, Europe is considered by the rest of the world very often as a beacon of standards, norms, but ultimately we're often also seen, as I say, as a citizen, as a cash machine. You know, you can do humanitarian, don't touch the politics, because on politics, the European Union, sadly, is not united enough. So the strength of the internal market is fantastic for trade and aid, but to leverage the potential in terms of foreign policy to promote and to be credible in seeing this through, I think, as the French would say, peut mieux faire, if I go to the school reports of some of my sons. They'll forgive me if I say so.
Sigrid, thank you very much. Minister Alvarez, let's tackle that head on. It has been a pretty devastating demonstration of European coherence since October 7th. We've all seen the stories of competing groups within the EU, the inability to reach decisions on statements. We saw in the last EU Council conclusions actually walking back a couple of issues that had previously been in statements. Is there any prospect of a meaningful push by Europe as a whole here? Can the next High Rep hope to do anything meaningful on this issue? Or do we really have to face the reality that it's going to be Spain, Ireland, Belgium, group of states working together to try and support and push forward change, and change that will have to involve being willing to put more pressure on Israel, given what has been said about their role as the occupying force here?
I hope we'll get to that unity. We need it, because many countries in the world are expecting a strong voice of Europe. People in the Arab world, of course the Palestinians are doing it. And we have shown in Ukraine and in October the 7th that we can speak with one single voice. There is, of course, different perception about the situation because of historical reasons for some countries, because some countries consider that we shouldn't get so much involved. But if we were able to do it, that means that we can do it as well in something as dangerous as this war that is really threatening to go regional if the military operation extends to Lebanon, which will give a completely different scale. And the second thing is that right now, and this is the role of Europe, really the role of Europe in the world, I really believe, and I say it in front of the High Representative, it's also a matter of upholding international law, and international humanitarian law, and backing ICJ. And if the European Union doesn't speak up united on that, I don't know who in the world is going to do it. In October the 7th, we all woke up saying, this is a terrorist attack of a terrorist organization. And we expressed solidarity with the 1,200 innocent Israelis that were killed. And suddenly we started to divide, because what should be, because Israel has the right to repel a terrorist attack, as any state on earth, we started to see that this wasn't exactly an anti-terrorist operation, that was looking like a war. And then we divided even more, because some people believe that UNRWA could be doing wrong things, when for some of us, UNRWA, and today we are all going back to that consensus, is the indispensable UN agency to take care of 6 million of Palestinian refugees in Gaza, but in many other countries. And right now, we are also confronted to a similar subject, and ICJ has put out rulings already. One says military operation in Rafah must stop immediately. And we should at least, all the 27, say we back ICJ, we back United Nations, and we back international law. Otherwise, that will have an impact in the Arab world, but also in what we are saying in Ukraine, because really, the discredit of saying we have double standards will be very obvious, even for something that is at the heart of the European Union vision of the world.
Minister, thank you. Minister, let me pivot to the regional situation with you. Obviously, we're very aware of the risks of a war in northern Israel with Hezbollah. How worried are you of that prospect, and what can be done to prevent it? And as part of that, can you unpack a bit your thinking on Saudi ties with Iran at the moment? We're in an interesting kind of paradoxical situation where the kingdom and other countries in the region are now have almost flipped position with where the Europeans were about a decade ago, in terms of talking about the need for engagement and dialogue with Iran as the only way to address regional problems. Whereas 10 years ago or so, you were promoting quite a more, shall we say, aggressive line to try and keep Iran boxed in. Does Iran have to be part of the solution to this regional crisis? And how do you see your role in helping bring that about?
I mean, obviously very concerned about the situation in southern Lebanon and the prospects for an extension of this conflict to what would become a state, a state involving another state, an Arab state, and something. And again, most concerned with the fact that there is no real clarity or strategic clarity in what's the end game in all of this. Is it clearing some certain area, etc.? There's no clarity. If this escalates, if it begins to become a conflict that involves the Lebanese territory, where does it end, and how can we push it to end? So this is, of course, very, very concerning, and the prospects of further regional escalation certainly exist, and something that we need to avoid. Obviously, the quickest prospect probably for an end to the potential of this escalation is through a ceasefire in Gaza. Absent that, certainly even for Israeli domestic political dynamics, it appears that a conflict and an attack on Hezbollah in Lebanon seems to be very much on the cards, unfortunately, and it's a shame that things are now being driven by domestic political considerations rather than broader strategic interests. And when it comes, obviously, to the engagement with Iran, Iran is our neighbor. It is a regional state, so it's absolutely necessary that we have as much as possible good relations with all of our neighbors, and we will continue to engage on that prospect. But I would say when it comes to the current conflict, the priority does need to remain on finding a pathway to a ceasefire in Gaza, and through that, a complete de-escalation of the tensions in the region. And here, I just want to quickly comment on the issue of Europe's role, because I think that's relevant to this discussion. And here, Europe does need to make a decision about how relevant it wants to be on the international stage. And Gaza and the conflict in Gaza is one of those test cases. And, to be honest, we are all watching and we are all evaluating whether or not Europe has a unified stance towards the principles it espouses, or whether it is a purely interest-based and transactional approach. And, we will, going forward, take that into account. So when
operationally, what would that look like from in terms of what Riyadh would want from Europe?
So in the instance of Gaza, for instance, you have the basic principles of international law, international humanitarian law being violated every day, when it comes to something just as simple as humanitarian access. And here it would be very easy for Europe to in the context of its desire to focus on humanitarian issues, to at the very least hold Israel accountable when it comes to whether or not it lives up to its responsibilities to allowing the civilian population of Gaza to have access to humanitarian needs, and when it doesn't, to actually quite clearly take action. It doesn't have to be anything drastic, but it could at the very least be an ability to take a position by 27 states to condemn Israel's non-adherence to its commitments. And then the same goes for the issue of keeping the two-state solution alive. Again, everybody says we believe in the two-state solution. And everybody says that we realize that the only pathway to a sustainable peace in the region is a two-state solution. Yet, when there is consistent and constant undermining of that two-state solution, we do nothing, or we give limited statements. So when we see confiscation of additional territories, there's not even a condemnation. When we see actions by settlers and by settler groups that constantly undermine the Palestinian Authority, that are violent attacks against Palestinians and Palestinian civilians, maybe we sanction two individuals, but we do nothing against the government officials behind that. And what I want to say on the issue of keeping the two-state solution alive and Europe taking a stronger role in actually taking action when that's being undermined and hopefully leading the international community to regard. This is not just standing up for Europe's principles, but it's also in Europe's interests, and I would argue it is also in Israel's interests, and Europe, as friends of Israel, when Israel is taking action that in the long term harms its own interest, should stand up and tell Israel to stop, because the only pathway for a sustainable peace, even for Israel, and this is something we all believe in the region. We believe in peace and integration in the region, but that can only come through a real peace, and that peace has to be through the establishment of a Palestinian state and through giving the Palestinians the right. So I would argue that this is a watershed moment where everybody's watching and everybody's evaluating whether or not Europe does stand on principle, whether or not Europe does want to be an actor on the global stage when it comes to geopolitics and global policy, or whether it is only there to act when it is immediately threatened in its own neighborhood, and other than that, it's a trade bloc, and we can talk about trade and other investment.
Minister, thank you. Sigrid, let me come back to you, and we'll dive back into Gaza. You're also the reconstruction coordinator, which suggests kind of looking slightly ahead, and obviously there's been lots of talk about a day after. Mostly in terms of not having a day after. The Israelis certainly don't seem to be putting one on the table, and everyone else is kind of flummoxing around trying to work out what that means and how we adapt. Do you have a vision of what a day after could look like, what a functional pathway forward would be? You've talked about the need for the PA to be involved. Again, Israel is rejecting that. How do you see that? And also, but what if there is no day after? What if we don't get a ceasefire anytime soon? How do we continue to adapt to meet some of the needs on the ground without that opening, which does provide the space for more aid and thinking and actioning a day after plan?
Yeah. Let me see. I think it's threefold. First of all, it's not whether it's my vision or not. There's a clear UN position on the two-state solution, as already underscored by His Royal Highness, on the importance of the Palestinian Authority, reformed, revitalized. There are a few adjectives, the 3 R's floating around, but reformed, and of course the role we can all play collectively to enable them to perform their role. But ultimately, a return of the PA is intrinsically linked to the political process, to the horizon. Now, I believe, dependent on whom you speak to in Israel, at the moment, indeed, there's, let's say, not a welcome, or rather a formal invite to the PA to return. It's more of a rejection, the way I read it, indeed, in the media. However, from an Israeli perspective, it's very clear that their focus is security when it comes to Gaza, security arrangements. I read a lot on demilitarization, different options. The problem is we have a lot of ideas floating out there, but there's not a formal discussion taking place, to my mind. I know behind the scenes, but the UN is not privy to that. So our position is very clear, in line with Security Council resolutions, the two-state solution, the need for clarity around the governance, and the security arrangements. And we need to recognize first and foremost, after the 7th of October, for the individual Israeli citizen, as well as this or other governments, the need for security to be crystal clear, to avoid ever the risk of a repeat of 7th of October. I think we can all understand and underscore that. However, you need to have the conversation. From the UN, the PA is an essential element in this, related to the recognition of statehood and the peace process. The problem is, in the absence of clarity or political discussions, both on governance and security arrangements, it's very hard to convince an average investor, a Palestinian businessman who are very keen, be they in diaspora or just the West Bank, to put their money on the line. The EU, for instance, I'll speak to a Dutch example and keep it close to home. The port in Gaza has been destroyed 3 times. I know that successive ministers of international cooperation in the Netherlands have put money at the time into the rebuilding of the port. There comes a point where most countries and investors say, no more. First, we need to know what the parameters are. We need our own guarantees, politically and otherwise, to ensure that reconstruction merits the investment case made. This is the important political message I think we hear across. Reconstruction in terms of content, the way I've outlined it to the Security Council, starting with rehabilitation of the health services. That needs to happen regardless, even if the fighting still goes on, because we're on the verge, on the eve of a public health disaster in the absence of clean water, waste management, sanitation. You don't have to be a medical doctor to understand that people are ill, will become even sicker. So these are the things that need to happen. Children need to be in school. In the Syria crisis, we've always said, no lost generation. Well, surprise, surprise, we do have a lost generation of children out of a middle-income country where they prided themselves on the high levels of educational attainments. The same applies to the Palestinians in Gaza. So we can act now. For that, we need the investments and the generosity to make the political case that, yes, Gaza is an intrinsic part of a future political state, and yes, a future Gaza will be part of that security dimension that is so important for the Israeli polity and citizens alike. So the technicalities around reconstruction will be mind-boggling if you just look at the billions of debris and the time factor not being on our side, but that can be done. It's the political will, once more, to choose governance, to make the push. If it needs transitional arrangements, parties need to discuss that, and the security arrangements are potentially also not difficult, but challenging. And the more we wait, the more the unknown and unspoken grows in a very grey vacuum, and people will suffer.
Thank you very much. I want to open it up to the floor for questions now. Before I do that, one last question for our Saudi colleague. The US question. I would love to ask you how Riyadh is calibrating for the different possible scenarios of a Trump or Biden administration. I doubt I'll get much from you, but I'll put it on the table. But more realistically, I think Riyadh, like lots of regional states, have been looking for US leadership on this issue, and there's been a sense of a lack of US leadership, sufficient US leadership in taking this forward. Given that we are now approaching the US election and the weight of US domestic politics on this issue, do you think that space for a US leadership role is closing? Has it already closed? And does that forestall the ability to get a solution? And we all know that there are politicians in the region who are quite adept at playing down the US political calendar and using that for their advantage. So how do you interpret what's happening in the US, what happened in the debate last week, and the...
So, I mean, obviously we've had a fantastic working relationship with the Biden administration, especially over the last couple of years. We had a good relationship with the Trump administration, so we are quite prepared for any outcome. We have this approach of being very engaged with whatever U.S. administration happens to be in place. That's up to the U.S. people. Is the space for U.S. leadership closing? No, because the U.S. is just too relevant, too important for the space for it to close. Now, obviously, election dynamics being what they are, bandwidth being, for human bandwidth being what it is, it's probably likely that they will be less engaged. I hope that we can use whatever time is left before the election cycle really takes hold to make a breakthrough. And here, the US taking a strong role can be very, very helpful. I actually just talked to Tony Blinken yesterday about how we can potentially move some of the issues that we're working on together, Gaza, Sudan, and others forward. And I think that the US will continue to be engaged. This administration continue to engage to the last minute. But I mean, election dynamics being as you pointed out, there will be a point where attention will have to focus on the campaign, and that will reflect itself on the regional dynamics, no doubt.
Thank you very much. If there's a microphone circulating, I don't know if someone has a microphone. If you could just choose whoever you want to. I see there's a gentleman there, Nicola over there. Please, I'll take a group of questions if that's okay with you, and then I'll come back to you.
Well, thank you. I wish to start by commending Ireland and Spain, who are the two European countries who have shown any principles in this present crisis. But the rest of the EU has been weak or even irrelevant, unfortunately. This has not always been the case. Javier Solana will recall that in 2006, when Finland happened to hold the EU presidency, we had a quartet with the UN, the US, Russia, and Europe working together on the basis of a roadmap, a peace plan drafted by the European Union. Of course, it went nowhere. That was again the case. But we managed to play a role in bringing a ceasefire to Lebanon at the height of the another war at the time. But that was when the EU was united. We were united behind the roadmap. But today, I know that it has been proven to be impossible to repeat, to accept those statements which we have agreed unanimously previously. This is no longer the case, because we have some countries who rather report first to the Israeli government rather than to their own governments, to put this quite bluntly. So that means that the EU has been very irrelevant. But you mentioned, Mr. Minister, that double standards, and I think this is the issue. Now, not only a disunity, but also the perception of double standards. We have taken a clear stand on the illegal occupation of the Crimea immediately. It happened in 2014, and adopted sanctions. But we have never even talked about sanctions, about the illegal occupation of the Palestinian territories. And as long as this continues, we will be accused quite rightly of double standards by the eyes of the rest of the world. And this gap is growing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The question of sanctions. Nicola, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Nicola Reindorp, and I have the honour to be the CEO of Crisis Action, which forges coalitions among civil society to engage those with the responsibility to protect civilians from conflict, to take action and to prevent such conflict. And that includes one of the largest coalitions we have ever worked on, of more than 1,000 organisations across the world, Israeli, Palestinian, humanitarian, human rights, united in the call for a ceasefire and the release of hostages, because they believe that is the only way to stop violence that is immoral, illegal, and counter to the security of the people of both Israel and Palestine. I wonder, Excellencies, colleagues, can you do a little more to be drawn on two things? One is that real risk of the escalation in Lebanon. Excellency, you commented that this may be driven by domestic concerns of Israel and perhaps the desire of Bibi Netanyahu to distract from what is happening in Gaza and the West Bank and instead turn to another front. Can you give a little bit more, any members of the panel, about what really is happening right now to head off that very, very frightening escalation on top of the current agony, and your thought of the timeframes of how much effort needs to be put in that preventive effort? Secondly, on the ceasefire, again, we heard the comment that Europe should be denouncing the cessation of humanitarian assistance. Is that really all that we can expect of Europe, and what more needs to be done on the ceasefire? And if I may very briefly, just that mention of Sudan at the end, where of course the connection, where the United Arab Emirates is reportedly by a UN panel actively arming a force that is currently committing crimes against humanity and potentially genocide. Anything more we can hear about what Europe can be doing with its ties and connections with the Emirates and others in another part of the world that is very connected to the Middle East? Thank you.
Nicola, thank you very much. There was Anthony Dworkin then. There was a gentleman in the row behind him first, I believe. Anthony, if you wouldn't mind taking the mic and passing it. There was a gentleman. Was there? I saw someone waving. No, we're passing. Okay, Anthony, why don't you go ahead? Any last hands that people want to? And then Jean-Marie Guénot after. Anthony, please.
Thanks. I'm Anthony Dworkin with ECFR. This is really a question for Minister Alvarez. You spoke powerfully about the importance of international law and Europe standing up for international law, and you spoke about the International Court of Justice. But of course, there's also the International Criminal Court, where the prosecutor has applied for arrest warrants against Israel's Prime Minister and Defense Minister. If those warrants are forthcoming, would you expect any significant change in the way Europe deals with those individuals? Thank you.
Thank you. Jean-Marie, please.
China played some role in the rapprochement between your country and Iran. Would you expect China to play a more active role on the question of Palestine? Because China has significant interest in the Middle East, but so far has been pretty cautious in the way it engages with the region.
And then I'll take one last question from over here.
Yeah, Eckert von Kleen from Germany. I have a small observation and then a question. First of all, if we see the history, let's say in the last 20 years in the Palestinian territories, we have on the one hand in the West Bank a corrupt regime and a President Abu Mazen who is now, I think, in the 19th year of his first 4 years term as a president. We have seen, on the other hand, a civil war between Hamas and Fatah in the Gaza Strip. Hamas won and established a terrorist regime. I have to say it's beyond my wisdom why it is aligned with European values to acknowledge such a, in quote, state now. And the other point is, how can we come now to a two-state solution from a sustainable ceasefire everyone is arguing for? The main reason is that there's no force to replace the administration or the force of Hamas. And I do not see any proposal from those states who acknowledged Palestine as a state to do so, to go with a European or a UN mandate to go into Gaza and establish something that could secure a ceasefire. And as long as no one, and the main reason is not the fear of Israel, the main reason is the fear of Hamas and Iran. And if we do not have a solution for this, for the next immediate steps that are not contradictional to a two-state solution that really deserves this name, I think it is not a very serious debate.
Thank you very much. So we had some very big issues put on the table across those questions. You may also want to reflect on other comments across the panel. Sigrid, can I start with you first? I came to you last time, but if there's anything else that you feel that you would like to ensure that Europeans are hearing, if any of the questions strike you as particularly important.
No, I think, I didn't hear particular questions addressed to me. I think it's very important the European Union, individually its member states, but also the voice of the Union, is a very important partner to the UN through all the fora. But indeed, if we look at what's happening with humanitarian assistance worldwide, it cannot be a substitute for the absence of political choices that are in line with peace and security, and you see that across the board. And I know this too as a former minister. If you don't know what else to do, well, we end up throwing money at the problem, which is also needed, but it doesn't address, in many situations, root causes. And then you come back to the political choice. The two-state solution is an important one. The way to get there has always been troubling, let's put it that way, mildly. But ultimately, innocent civilians suffer We've seen that on the Israeli side. We see it consistently also on the Palestinian side. So it's a duty of politicians to figure out how, at this critical historical juncture, I would say, we can address and move forward on this. And indeed, you need a reform of the Palestinian Authority. You need to have clarity on security arrangements. But saying it's too difficult, to my mind, is not an excuse. And the United Nations is often seen through the lens of all the funds and programs. But I think if you go back to the Charter, the ultimate goal is peace and security. And you underpin that through all the other avenues. And this is where I think the European Union could potentially play a greater role. But you've got to want to play it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Minister Alvarez, lots of different questions there, but I'm struck by the kind of being caught between two issues there. On the one hand, we had a very kind of clear presentation of the corruption of the PA, the fact that Hamas is a terrorist organization, there's no security on the ground. You know, how does recognition engage with those realities? On the other hand, you had someone else saying, well, why aren't we sanctioning Israel? Look at the crimes they're committing. If it was anywhere else in the world, we'd be sanctioning for the pain they're imposing on Palestinian civilians. So how does Europe navigate that pathway?
I think we have to be very clear about how we should move forward the day the peace will go back to Gaza. For me, it's very clear that Hamas is not a partner for peace. They have proven it. 1,200 innocent Israelis killed in one day, and this policy of non-recognition and destroying the state of Israel. And Spain believes in the two-state solution, Palestine, but also Israel. But I think that it has been a very poor business to be undermining for years the Palestinian National Authority. For instance, as it's happening right now, withholding the tax revenues for the Palestinian Authority doesn't help at all peace and stability in the region. Pursuing the illegal settlement policy that has been condemned many times by United Nations and all countries on earth, it's a very poor policy. Because at the end is, what's your policy for the millions of Palestinians that are living in the occupied territory? Do you have one? If not, let's go to what has been agreed many times, included by Israel and Palestinians itself, and it's the two-state solution. So as soon as peace goes in, humanitarian assistance massively should go in Gaza. And we should all be ready, and Spain is ready, bilaterally and by pushing EU to do a massive economic plan. As soon as peace goes back, we should put under one single Palestinian Authority, and definitely it cannot be Hamas, both Gaza and the West Bank. And we must do this conference to implement the two-state solution. Once we have those territories and the one single authority, you must give them territorial continuity, connected with a corridor, give it an exit to the sea, a port in Gaza, and put the capital in East Jerusalem. And at the same time, let's help all the Arab states and Israel to normalize the relationship. That will bring peace, stability, and the legitimate claim of security that Israelis have. And right now, to go back to the first intervention, we are not only facing two standards, Ukraine, Gaza, whether we care more for children when they are white and with blue eyes than when they are dark with dark eyes or not. We are facing, if we want to continue upholding international law, the ICJ, the Secretary General of United Nations, Sigrid, UNRWA. This is very basic things. It's how the world has been functioning since the end of World War II. All that is also at stake in the Middle East. And we are very worried, of course, there was a question about that, about the extension of the war in Lebanon, because this changes completely the state. We are talking, Lebanon is a sovereign state that will be attacked by other sovereign states. So this is very serious. This is what we are condemning in the Russian aggression against Ukraine. And of course, Spain is part of the ICJ, and we have said it, I've said it publicly as Minister of Foreign Affairs of Spain. We are right now in ICC waiting. The general prosecutor has asked for this warrant. It's to the court to decide. It's not to me. I'm not a judge. I'm a Minister of Foreign Affairs. But if the court decides so, of course, we will abide by international law, by what the court says. We are one of the founding members of the Rome Statute. We will do it, but we'll see.
And sorry, just quickly, if we're serious, can we expect any chance of Spanish or European troops on the ground to help guarantee security?
This is not at the table right now, but this shows also the real pointless war that is going on. The one that is doing the war has no policy, doesn't know what he wants to achieve, doesn't know what will happen afterwards. So you cannot start a war and say the problem is for the others. You start the war. Tell me, what's your objective? What's your policy?
Thank you. Minister, let me come to you, a bunch of different questions. Let me also just quickly throw Yemen into the mix. Obviously, a long-standing horrific conflict going on there. You were close to a roadmap with the Houthis, it seemed. I know you're still talking with them, but obviously we see the escalation in the Red Sea, which has big, broader implications. How can we manage that situation so it doesn't unravel?
So I'll first address a couple of the questions that were posed, because I think they're important. First, on the issue of how to deal with the day after. Certainly the Arab concept that was presented to the United States, to the Europeans, quite clearly addresses the issues raised by the questioner, including governance, including security. We would envision the Palestinian Authority coming in and taking responsibility. They have people on the ground that ostensibly can do that, especially in the management of civil services and the like. But they would need to be empowered by some form of an international force that could come in under UN mandate. Certainly, it is absolutely necessary that the security situation be controlled, and we all agree that that has to be by someone that everybody can trust. On the issue of the Palestinian state, I would ask the gentleman that posed the question, the beginning question should be, do the Palestinian people deserve a state? It's not about the Palestinian leadership. This is an issue of self-determination for the people of Palestine. So if we all agree that the people of Palestine deserve self-determination, and we understand that it is their desire to have a state of their own, then they deserve a state and they deserve to be recognized. How they are governed is up to the Palestinian people, and how we deal with them then is a reflection of whether or not that government is responsible and is able to live up to its responsibilities to its neighbors. And in that regard, I would point out that the Palestinian Authority, with all of the challenges that have been put in its place, with all of the difficulties that it has to deal with, and stipulating that it is an imperfect authority, has lived up to its responsibility to Israel, its main responsibility to Israel, which is providing security. And even with the difficult situation that we face now, the West Bank has not been a source of threat to Israel's security. Nonetheless, Israel continues to actively undermine every day that same authority that has lived up to all of its commitments under Oslo. At the same time, when we see what happened in Gaza, it has been well reported, including in Israeli media, that it was a policy of the Israeli government to continue to empower Hamas's control of Gaza as a way of undermining the prospects for a two-state solution. This is quite clear. So what I would say is that the surest path to address not just the rights of the Palestinian people, but also the legitimate security concerns of Israel and the opportunities that exist for a fully integrated Israel in the region, is through an establishment of the Palestinian state. And that pathway to a Palestinian state puts a responsibility on the Palestinians for ensuring good governance of the territories they control, but also puts a responsibility on us as the international community, and especially those that advocate for a Palestinian state, to ensure that that Palestinian state lives up to its responsibility to its people and to its neighbors. And that will certainly not be an easy task, but it is a necessary task, because if we say they are not ready, when will they be ready? It will never be exactly perfect. So we must start from the point that we all agree, that Palestine deserves self-determination, and that comes through a state. I will also point out that they have a new government, and that government has made significant commitments to reform, which has been lauded by the international community. The status of President Abbas, of course, is also something that he has talked about before, and it's up to the Palestinians to decide. It's not up to us to tell them how to live their lives. We can only say, these are your responsibilities, you must live up to them. Thank you.
Yemen, just 1 second.
Yemen, of course, we are continuing to have a dialogue, and we continue to be ready to engage in the roadmap. It is ready. We would like to sign it as soon as possible, because we need to move to a better place. The situation in Yemen continues to be difficult economically and otherwise, and I think through a signing of the roadmap we can move forward. We hope that will happen sooner rather than later.
Thank you very much. Your Highness, Minister Albaraz, Sigrid Kaag, you've put an immense amount on the table. This is devilishly complex, tragic beyond measure, and there's clearly a lot of work ahead, and I hope that it will be an issue that continues to bear down on you until we do get that end goal that I think we all recognize as being the necessary and the only pathway towards securing the rights and the security of both Israelis and Palestinians, and we'll continue to work on that at ECFR. So thank you very much for that very frank and open conversation, and thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you very much. I will ask you once again, for those of you who have not voted for the wildcard session tomorrow, you can still do that. And for all of us, we should move out. There is a debate on what China thinks. It's going to be outside on the terrace. We will start in less than 15 minutes.